I thought my stepmom was just being kind, helping me clean my room, but what she asked for next left me frozen. She stepped in, her soft perfume lingering in the air, and smiled in a way that sent chills down my spine. "Would you give me a back massage?" she asked, her voice calm yet too intimate. I knew in that moment, nothing between us would ever be the same. Growing up, I always saw my stepmom, Karen, as the epitome of kindness. She was the one who stepped in when my real mom left, filling a void I never thought could be filled. Karen wasn't just a mother figure. She was the glue that held our family together. She always put everyone's needs before her own, ensuring that my dad and I never felt the cracks that life had left behind. Our home was a peaceful one, with routines that gave me comfort. I'd often find her in the kitchen, humming softly to herself while making breakfast, or hear her laughter echoing as she watched TV with Dad. She had a way of making everyone feel safe, secure. At least, that's what I believed. For years, I saw Karen as the perfect partner to my father, a loving wife who never strayed, never faltered. They shared inside jokes, quiet dinners, and the occasional dance in the living room when they thought no one was looking. She was the cornerstone of what I thought was an unbreakable bond between them. But as time went on, subtle changes began to creep in. My father's work kept him away longer, and Karen seemed different. She started spending more time in the gym, focusing on her appearance. She bought new clothes, ones more suited for someone in her 20s than her 40s, and seemed almost restless, as if the world she'd built no longer satisfied her. I dismissed these changes at first. After all, wasn't she allowed to take care of herself? But then there were the moments I couldn't ignore. The lingering looks, the way her hand would rest just a little too long on my shoulder, the occasional comment that felt more personal than it should have. Still, I told myself it was nothing. Karen was just trying to be close, trying to bridge the gap that had formed as I grew older and more distant. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. That the woman I had always trusted, the woman who had always been a second mother to me, wasn't quite who I thought she was. It started with small things, almost imperceptible at first. Karen would linger in the doorway when I was in my room, her eyes scanning the space as if searching for something. "You've grown up so much," she'd say with a wistful smile that felt oddly personal. Her compliments, once innocent and motherly, began to carry an undercurrent I couldn't quite define. One evening, as I sat at the dining table scrolling through my phone, I noticed her watching me. Her gaze wasn't harsh or disapproving. It was soft, almost contemplative. When I caught her eye, she quickly looked away, pretending to focus on the dinner she was serving. It wasn't the first time I'd noticed these lingering stares, but I convinced myself it was just my imagination. The real shift came late one night. My dad was working late, as usual, and I was in the living room playing video games. Karen walked in wearing a fitted dress that I hadn't seen before. It wasn't overly revealing, but it clung to her figure in a way that made me uncomfortable. "Do you mind if I sit with you?" she asked, her tone casual but her smile. It wasn't. I nodded, trying to focus on the screen. She sat closer than she needed to, her arm brushing against mine. The scent of her perfume was stronger than usual, and I found myself distracted. "You've been working out," she said, her voice light but pointed. "You're looking good." Thanks," I replied, my throat dry. I tried to laugh it off, but her words hung in the air longer than they should have. Over the next few weeks, her behavior grew bolder. She began asking me to help her with small tasks, lifting heavy boxes, reaching for items on high shelves, and each request came with a touch on my arm, a lingering hand on my back, or a warm smile that felt anything but innocent. When I'd brush it off or excuse myself, she'd laugh softly and say, "You're so shy." "It's cute." The tension hit a peak one afternoon when I came home early from school. Karen was in the kitchen, her hair down and makeup done as if she were going out, though she hadn't mentioned any plans. "You're home early," she said, surprised but clearly pleased. "Why don't you keep me company for a bit?" I hesitated but sat at the counter. As she leaned over to grab something, her blouse slipped slightly, revealing more than I was prepared to see. She caught me looking and didn't adjust it immediately. Instead, she smiled, a knowing smile that made my stomach twist. "Oops," she said, finally fixing her top. "You're so polite." After that, I started avoiding her as much as possible, but it didn't stop her. If anything, it seemed to encourage her. The more distant I became, the more she sought me out, her touches and comments growing more frequent, more daring. I told myself it was all in my head, that Karen was just being friendly, playful even. But the glances, the touches, the way her voice softened when she spoke to me, It all felt calculated. I started to question everything. Was I imagining it? Or was there something darker at play? The line between what was right and what was wrong blurred one evening when Karen asked for my help in the garage. Dad was still at work, and the house felt eerily quiet as I followed her. She wore a loose shirt that slid slightly off her shoulder, paired with yoga pants that clung to her figure. My heart raced as I tried to focus on the task she'd given me, but her proximity made it impossible. "I just need you to hold this for me," she said, handing me a box. As I held it steady, she leaned closer than necessary, her hair brushing against my arm. Her voice dropped slightly as she added, "You've always been so dependable. I don't know what I'd do without you." Her words lingered in the air like smoke, suffocating and intoxicating. I laughed nervously, shifting my weight to create some distance, but she didn't move. Instead, her hand rested lightly on my forearm. "You've really grown up, you know," she said, her gaze meeting mine. "I barely recognize you anymore." I felt my cheeks flush, and quickly turned my attention back to the box. "Thanks," I mumbled, hoping she'd let it go, but she didn't. Instead, she stepped closer, her hand sliding down to my wrist. "You're always so tense," she said softly, her fingers tracing small circles on my skin. "You should relax more." My breath caught in my throat as her touch lingered. My mind screamed at me to step away, to say something, anything, but I was frozen. That night, I couldn't sleep. My thoughts were a tangled mess of confusion and guilt. I told myself I was overthinking it, that Karen's behavior was harmless. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I couldn't shake the way her touch had made me feel, how it had lingered long after she walked away. Over the next few days, Karen's advances became harder to ignore. She'd find reasons to brush against me as she walked by, her hand lingering on my shoulder or lower back. She started texting me little messages when Dad wasn't home. At first, they were innocent, asking if I needed anything from the store, for example, but then they grew more personal. "You're so quiet lately. Are you avoiding me?" one message read. Another said, "I miss our little talks. You can tell me anything, you know." One afternoon, as I was finishing my homework in the living room, she walked in carrying a laundry basket. She paused, watching me for a moment before setting it down. "You've been working so hard," she said. "Why don't you take a break?" I hesitated, unsure of her intentions. "I'm almost done," I replied, keeping my eyes on my notebook. But she wasn't deterred. She walked over and sat beside me, close enough that I could feel the warmth of her body. "You've got so much tension in your shoulders," she said, reaching out to touch me before I could react. Her hands were warm, her fingers pressing gently into my muscles. "Let me help." "Karen, I'm fine," I said, trying to pull away, but she held firm, her grip gentle yet insistent. "Relax," she murmured. "I just want to take care of you." Her voice was soothing, almost hypnotic, and against my better judgment, I let her continue. Her hands moved slowly, her touch both comforting and unnervingly intimate. As her hands worked their way down my back, she leaned closer, her breath warm against my ear. "You deserve to feel good," she whispered, her tone low and deliberate. My heart pounded as I struggled to process what was happening. Every fiber of my being told me to stop this, to stand up and walk away, but I couldn't move. Her touch became slower, more deliberate, as if testing my boundaries. "Do you like this?" she asked softly, her voice barely audible. I didn't respond, couldn't respond. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions, guilt, confusion, and something I didn't want to acknowledge. The moment felt endless, stretched thin by the weight of unspoken words. When her hands finally stilled, she didn't move away. Instead, she leaned in closer, her lips brushing against my ear as she whispered, "You can trust me. I'll never hurt you." Those words shattered what little resolve I had left. I stood abruptly, my chair scraping against the floor as I stepped away. "I need to go," I stammered, avoiding her gaze. She looked up at me, her expression unreadable, a mix of surprise and something deeper, disappointment perhaps. "Of course," she said after a moment, her tone calm but laced with something I couldn't place. "Whenever you're ready, we can talk." I nodded quickly and left the room, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had crossed a line, or maybe she had, and that nothing would ever be the same again. The tension between Karen and me reached its breaking point one evening when my dad announced he'd be working late again. I was in my room, trying to distract myself with anything that could take my mind off the strange, unspoken dynamic growing between us. But as the hours ticked by, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. The knock on my door was soft, almost hesitant, but I knew it was her. "Come in," I said reluctantly, bracing myself for whatever reason she had to interrupt my solitude. Karen stepped inside, carrying a laundry basket. "I thought I'd bring these in for you," she said with a smile, setting the basket on my bed. She didn't leave immediately. Instead, she stood there, her hands resting on her hips as she looked around my room. "You've really made this space your own," she said, her tone casual, but her eyes told a different story. "Thanks," I muttered, hoping she'd take the hint and leave, but she didn't. Instead, she walked over to my desk, her fingers lightly brushing against the items scattered across it. "It's a bit cluttered, though," she said with a teasing smile. "You should let me help you organize it." Before I could respond, she turned back to me, her expression softening. "Actually, I was hoping you could help me with something." Her voice was calm, almost too calm, and it sent a shiver down my spine. "What is it?" I asked, forcing my voice to stay steady. "I've been dealing with some tension in my back," she said, gesturing to her shoulders. "I was wondering if you could give me a quick massage, just to help me relax." My heart sank. I wanted to say no, to make up an excuse, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I nodded, my throat dry as I gestured for her to sit on the edge of the bed. She sat down, her back to me, and pulled her hair to one side, exposing the curve of her neck. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. I hesitated for a moment before placing my hands on her shoulders, my touch tentative and unsure. Her skin was warm under my hands, and I could feel the tension in her muscles as I worked. "That feels good," she murmured, her tone laced with something that made my chest tighten. I tried to focus on the task at hand, to ignore the way her body shifted slightly under my touch, but it was impossible. As I worked my way down her back, her breathing grew slower, deeper. "You're good at this," she said, her voice low and intimate. "I didn't know you had such strong hands." I didn't respond, couldn't respond. The air in the room felt heavy, charged with something I couldn't name. Her hand reached up suddenly, covering mine as it rested on her shoulder. "Don't stop," she said softly, her fingers squeezing mine. "Karen," I began, my voice trembling, but she turned her head to look at me, her eyes locking onto mine. "It's okay," she said, her expression calm but intense. "You don't have to be afraid." "I'm not," I started, but she cut me off, her hand moving to cup my cheek. Her touch was gentle, but it sent a shockwave through me. "You've been so distant lately," she said, her tone almost pleading. "I just want us to be close again." "This isn't right," I managed to say, stepping back, but she stood up, closing the distance between us. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking slightly. "I need this." The words hung in the air like a weight, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. Then, the sound of the front door opening shattered the moment. My dad was home. Karen froze, her eyes wide with panic. "Don't say anything," she said quickly, grabbing the laundry basket and rushing out of the room. I stood there, my heart pounding in my chest as I tried to process what had just happened. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Karen acted as though nothing had happened, laughing and chatting with my dad as if everything was normal. But every time our eyes met, I could see the fear, the uncertainty, and something else, something darker. Later that night, I couldn't sleep. My mind was racing, replaying every moment in excruciating detail. I didn't know what to do, who to talk to. My relationship with my dad flashed before my eyes, the trust we'd built over the years now teetering on the edge of destruction. The next morning, Karen cornered me in the kitchen. "We need to talk," she said, her voice low and urgent. "About last night." "There's nothing to talk about," I said, trying to push past her, but she grabbed my arm, her grip firm. "Please," she said, her eyes pleading. "You can't tell him. It would ruin everything." "Maybe it should be ruined," I shot back, my voice louder than I intended. She flinched, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of vulnerability in her eyes. "I made a mistake," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But if you tell him, it'll destroy this family. Do you really want that?" Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I didn't know what I wanted anymore. All I knew was that nothing would ever be the same. The morning after, the house felt like it was holding its breath. Karen avoided me at breakfast, busying herself with cleaning up plates that didn't need cleaning, her smile brittle whenever my dad spoke to her. I couldn't bring myself to look at either of them. The weight of the previous night hung over me like a storm cloud. I spent most of the day in my room, trying to distract myself with schoolwork, video games, anything to drown out the chaos in my mind. But no matter how hard I tried, my thoughts kept circling back to what had happened. Karen's words, her touch, her desperation, it all replayed in vivid detail. When my dad finally left for work that afternoon, Karen knocked on my door. I considered ignoring her, pretending I wasn't there, but the persistent tapping told me she wasn't going to leave. "We need to talk," she said, her voice muffled but firm. Reluctantly, I opened the door. She stepped inside, closing it behind her, and stood there for a moment, wringing her hands. She looked different, her usual confidence replaced by an almost childlike nervousness. "I just want to explain," she began, her voice trembling. "There's nothing to explain," I said, cutting her off. "It was wrong, Karen. You know that." "I know," she admitted, her voice breaking. "I know it was wrong. But I wasn't thinking straight. I've been lonely." Her words hit me like a slap. "Lonely? You're married to my dad." Her face crumpled, and for the first time, I saw real tears in her eyes. "I love your dad," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "But he's never here anymore. He's always at work, and when he's home, he's distant." I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to comfort her, to tell her everything would be okay, but another part of me was angry. Angry that she would use her loneliness as an excuse for what she'd done. "I made a mistake," she said, stepping closer. "But I need you to understand. I didn't mean to hurt you." "You didn't just hurt me," I said, my voice rising. "You betrayed him. And now I'm stuck in the middle." Karen flinched at my words, but she didn't back down. "I'm asking you, begging you not to tell him. If he finds out, it'll destroy everything. Please, think about what it would do to him." Her plea left me frozen. She was right. If I told my dad, it would shatter our family. But if I didn't, I'd have to live with the weight of this secret forever. The next few days were agonizing. Karen acted as if nothing had happened, but every interaction between us was fraught with tension. My dad didn't seem to notice. He was too busy with work, too oblivious to the cracks forming beneath the surface. I tried to avoid her as much as possible, but it was impossible in a house this small. Every glance, every accidental brush of her hand, felt loaded with unspoken words. I couldn't escape the guilt, the confusion, the anger. Then, one evening, my dad called me into the living room. Karen was sitting on the couch, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression unreadable. My heart sank. "Is there something going on between you two?" my dad asked, his voice calm but firm. "Because I've noticed things have been off lately." I froze, my mind racing. Did he know? Had Karen told him? She glanced at me, her eyes pleading, but she didn't say a word. "No," I said quickly, shaking my head. "Nothing's going on." My dad studied me for a moment, his gaze piercing. "Are you sure?" "Yes," I lied, my stomach churning. He nodded slowly, as if he didn't entirely believe me, but he didn't press the issue. "All right," he said finally. "If there's something you want to talk about, you know you can come to me." I nodded, but I couldn't meet his eyes. "I know." When he left the room, Karen let out a shaky breath. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Don't thank me," I said, my voice cold. "I didn't do it for you." As the days turned into weeks, the tension between Karen and me didn't ease. Every interaction was a reminder of the secret we shared, the lie I had told to protect my dad. It felt like I was living in a house of cards, waiting for the inevitable collapse. Karen tried to bridge the gap, to act like things were normal, but I couldn't forgive her. Not yet, maybe not ever. And every time I looked at my dad, I felt a pang of guilt so sharp it was almost unbearable. The weight of the secret was suffocating, but I didn't know how to let it go. All I knew was that nothing would ever be the same again. The weight of the secret began to take its toll. Days turned into weeks, and the distance between Karen and me grew into a chasm that neither of us dared to cross. My dad remained blissfully unaware, his life consumed by work, while I carried the burden of what had happened, the lies I'd told, and the truth I kept hidden. I tried to bury myself in school and hobbies, hoping that if I kept busy enough, the memories would fade. But they didn't. Every time I walked into the kitchen or passed Karen in the hallway, the tension hit me like a tidal wave. Her attempts to act normal only made things worse. I could see the guilt in her eyes, hear it in her voice when she spoke to me, and it was a constant reminder of everything we had to pretend didn't happen. One night, after another silent dinner, I couldn't take it anymore. I found Karen sitting on the back porch, a glass of wine in her hand. The moonlight reflected off her face, highlighting the weariness in her expression. She didn't look up when I stepped outside. "Karen," I said, my voice steady but quiet. She turned to me, startled, as if she hadn't expected me to speak to her. "I need to say something," I continued, sitting down on the opposite side of the small table. "I can't keep living like this. It's tearing me apart." She nodded slowly, her gaze dropping to her hands. "I know," she said, her voice soft. "It's tearing me apart too." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the faint chirping of crickets in the distance. Finally, she broke the silence. "I never wanted to hurt you, or him," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't know why I let it get that far. I was selfish, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life." Her words hung in the air, heavy with sincerity. "I don't know if I can forgive you," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "You broke something, Karen. Something that might not ever be fixed." She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she said. "But I hope one day you'll be able to move past this. I hope we both can." Her honesty surprised me, but it didn't erase the damage that had been done. "I think the best thing we can do," I said after a long pause, "is try to keep things as normal as possible. For him." She wiped at her eyes and nodded. "You're right. He doesn't deserve to be hurt because of my mistakes." That conversation marked a turning point, but it wasn't a solution. We both agreed to keep the secret buried, to act like nothing had happened, but the damage was done. The trust was gone, and the scars of that night would remain, even if they faded with time. Months later, as I stood in the doorway of my dad's office, watching him work, I felt a pang of guilt so deep it nearly knocked the wind out of me. He deserved better, from her, from me. But life doesn't always offer clean resolutions. Sometimes you just have to live with the mess. If there was one thing I learned from this ordeal, it was the fragility of trust. It takes years to build, moments to break, and sometimes a lifetime to rebuild. Karen's actions, my silence, and the lies we both told were a stark reminder of how easy it is to lose sight of what matters. In the end, life moved on. The tension in the house eased, and we all fell into a rhythm that felt almost normal. But I knew deep down that nothing would ever be the same. And maybe that was the price we had to pay for keeping the peace. I often wonder what would have happened if I'd told my dad the truth, if I'd let the chips fall where they may. But I'll never know. All I can do now is move forward, carrying the lessons I've learned and hoping that one day, I'll find a way to forgive. Not just Karen, but myself. If you were in my shoes, would you have told the truth? Or kept the secret to protect your family? Let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Don't forget to like and share this story if it resonated with you. And hit that subscribe button for more shocking tales that will leave you questioning everything. You won't believe what's coming next.